The Hostel Incident. This happened back in spring of 2007 when my buddy and I were doing a month-long backpacking trip across Europe. We had started in London and took every imaginable mode of transportation through France, the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and finally ended our trip in Italy. Due to a bus delay, we arrived in Rome several hours later than scheduled. The folks at the hostel said they assumed we weren't going to show and rented out our beds to other travelers. Not to worry, they told us. There was a spillover property across the city they rented out for such an occasion. This was a 2-bedroom apartment with several bunk beds packed into the rooms. We had spent our last 3 nights in Europe along with a group of young Spaniards we ended up going clubbing with and having a blast. On our last day, our Spanish friends left and we were replaced by a large group of 10 Latin American men and 1 woman that we met briefly before heading out on our final night in Rome. There was a bit of a language barrier, but everyone seemed nice and we headed out separately. My friend and I got back to our bunks at around 2 a.m. and about an hour later the other group shambled in, clearly pretty drunk. They all got in their bunks and within 15 minutes the lights were out and they were snoring away, all but one. One of the young men on an upper bunk directly across from me was still awake, seemingly playing with his phone. My eyes were shut, and I was starting to drift off to sleep, just as a bright light hit me directly in the face and I heard the shutter click sound on his camera phone. Annoyed but not wanting to be confrontational, I turned onto my back, facing slightly away, hoping he would just go to bed. Instead, he continued taking photos of me, whispering obscenities in English that I won't repeat here. I realized that passivity was the wrong strategy when he got down off his bunk and crept over to mine. For a few moments he stood over me, apparently with his hands on the upper bunk where my traveling companion slept. At this point, my heart rate went through the roof and I quickly started considering options. A cold realization suddenly hit me. We were in a private apartment with no other travelers or staff in the building. If I confronted this person, he might awake his companions. I had no idea whether any of these men were dangerous, and if they were, we might be in it for the fight of our lives. If they were so inclined, they could probably kill us and just say we had left on schedule and we'd never be heard from again. I was thinking of kicking this dude in the stomach and bolting for the kitchen to grab a knife when he suddenly knelt down and reached into my bed. That was it. I sat up sharply and got right in his face, asking, "You fucking need something, dude?" as menacingly as I could. He froze. Without saying a word, he got up and walked into the common area. I heard the bathroom door shut. About a minute later, he got back in his bunk, and 10 minutes after that, he was snoring peacefully. I was wide awake, fully dressed and ready for the battle of my life. Shortly before dawn, I woke my friend and we got out of there. He did ask, "What was that guy doing last night?" But I have no idea how aware he was of the whole thing. We were on our flight to Heathrow a couple hours later and never discussed it since. So yeah, creepy photographer dude, if I see you in public, you might meet these hands, creep. What happened to my roommate? Many years ago, I was a travel writer in Europe. I did most of my trips alone. This story is about the first time I visited Prague. I've never been to Prague and the trip was last minute, so I had little time to prepare. My travel partner had dumped me in another country, and I was determined to make the best out of my trip by visiting a place I'd never been before. Upon arriving at the train station, I visited the accommodation office and asked for a hostel not far from the center. In my early 20s, winging it was part of the fun, I guess. These days, I'm far less adventurous. The hostel they sent me was to a sprawling, crumbling slate gray Art Deco building on a nondescript street about a 10-minute walk to Stare Mesto. The inside was probably beautiful at one time, but by the time I checked in, it was full of a shabby mismatched furniture and cheap stained carpet. Most of the light fixtures were broken too, leaving everything but the lobby dark and gloomy. It smelled of standing water and dust. I found my room, a double for $12 per night, and made note of the fact that I had a roommate. She wasn't there, but on her side of the room there was a suitcase, dressed neatly folded across the back of a plastic chair, a scattering of makeup containers on the beat-up desk, and a stack of German fashion magazines on the bed. As I had no plans or goals in this impromptu trip, I spent the afternoon exploring Old Town Square, the Jewish Quarter, and Wenceslas Square. I purchased some Czech crystal for my mom and painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. I also made reservations for a sunset dinner cruise for one. At around 6 p.m., I returned to my room to shower, change clothes, and unload my purchases. When I left my room about an hour later, there was no indication that my roommate had returned at any point during the day. After the cruise, I stopped at a tiny bar on Tinska and had a glass of wine. I'd heard horror stories about the dangers of Prague, but I felt no more trepidation than I did in any other large city. During the cobblestone streets, fog rolling off the Vltava, backlit Gothic architecture, and winding alleys made me think of Jack the Ripper and Dracula, but in a good way. It was nearing midnight when I returned to my hostel, so I was surprised to find that my roommate still had not returned. That wasn't uncommon, though. Backpackers are a fickle lot. She could have gone on a short overnight trip and just left her stuff behind, hooked up with a guy or a girl, and was holed up at their place or hanging out at another hostel. So I was surprised but not concerned. I took another shower before bed, however, and was surprised to find that things in the room had changed up in my return. Her bed was neatly turned down. The magazines had moved to the nightstand, and the dress was gone. The strangest thing, though, was the addition of a pink silky nightgown spread across the bed. My bed! Maybe she thought she still had the room to herself? I didn't see how. My shopping bags, clothes, and toiletries were in plain view. I gently moved the nightgown over to her bed and then settled in for the night as I wrote in my journal. I assumed she was in the shower or something nearby, so I expected her return shortly. After about an hour, though, her side was still empty. I needed to use the restroom before I went to sleep, so I made one last trip down the hall. The building was unusually quiet. There weren't the regular sounds of chatty backpackers, the clinking of glasses, or music that would normally leak through the walls. There was nothing. It was hushed like a church after the congregation had left. I found myself practically tiptoeing back. My room was near the end of the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor was darker than before. The few working lights were blinking as they struggled to stay lit, and it reminded me of a funhouse. A tightness began to fill my stomach, and I subconsciously quickened my steps. There wasn't a soul behind me, yet I kept glancing back over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone gaining momentum on me. The only sound was a soft thud of my flip-flops as they struck my soles. I was flooded with relief as I flung open my door, but it didn't last long. Everything was exactly as it was left, except for the silky nightgown, which is now back on my bed. Sleep came in fits and starts. I left the lamp on for a while, still convinced my roommate would be right back, but the shadow it cast made the room even spookier. It was too dark with the light off. I finally slipped into a deep sleep when I suddenly heard the door open. A man stood in the darkened doorway, the hall light behind him showing just enough for me to see his contorted face. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. "You have to help me." Too confused and disoriented to be scared, I sat up, scrubbed at my eyes, and reached for the lamp switch. But once the room was lit, I saw that the door was closed. There was no man. I quickly bounded off the bed and went for the door. It was locked. Nobody could have entered without a key, and the hallway? Empty. I passed the rest of the night fully clothed, sitting up in bed and with the lights on. Though I paid for 2 more nights, at 7 a.m. I gathered all of my stuff, went down to reception, and checked out. "By the way," I said to the receptionist, "my roommate never returned. I'm a little concerned." She picked up the room key, looked at it hard, frowned, and then glanced at her computer. "What room were you in again?" When I repeated it to her, she looked back at her screen. "Ma'am, that room's been empty for 3 weeks, and it's been cleaned since then. We only have 6 people in the whole building." The hostel has since been renovated and is now a luxury hotel. Hostel of Horror. Let me preface this story as why I was traveling alone. So, one of my best friends, Kalaya, and I work seasonally at a hiking lodge in BC for the summertime. We're both girls in our early 20s. She lives and goes to school in New Brunswick, and I work and live as a chef in Toronto for the winter. We decided this year, as I had bought a car, instead of flying back home, we would do an epic Canadian coast-to-coast road trip. Everything was going wonderfully, so wonderfully. In fact, we ended up staying longer in a few unexpected places and had to cut our East Coast portion of the trip short. Now, my friend Kalaya started her schooling on November 1st, so I dropped her home in Moncton, New Brunswick on Halloween and stayed the night at her place, planning to head back to Toronto the next day. After a few glasses of Chardonnay and some laughs, I decided I couldn't come this close to the East Coast and not see the Cabot Trail in Nova Scotia. So, knowing I still had a week more of vacation before my winter contract, I hastily booked a hostel for the next day, November 1st, at the Acolyte Hostel at the Cabot Trail. When I booked, only one option came up: a private dorm with a queen-size bed for $35. I thought, what a bargain, and booked immediately. I left Kalaya's house at Moncton at 7 a.m., knowing it was going to be a long drive. Now, the Cabot Trail is roughly 150 kilometers long, so I thought to be safe, I plugged the hostel address into my Google Maps and head straight there to get my bearings. I would arrive at the hostel for roughly noon, knowing it was too early to check in. I figured I'd consult with front desk and figure out the nearby hiking trails and bring my bags in later. I was about to travel at the hostel, according to Google, but all around me was nothing but farmland. Google instructed me, the destination is on your left. I saw nothing. About 50 yards up the road, I saw a wire bar bent to look like a letter A, spray painted bright red. I was staying at the Acolyte Hostel, so I guess that must be the place, and followed the dirt road. It led me to what I can only describe as a dilapidated bar, no signage. There were 2 cars parked in front, so I parked alongside and got out of my car to try and figure out where I was. Once I got out, a smallish man about mid-40s with dark hair and intense eyes popped out of the bar and asked me if I was staying with them tonight. I said yes. He said why I booked so last minute, and I explained to him my situation. Seemingly satisfied with my answer, he insisted on taking me on the grand tour of the barn. The first thing I noticed was that the entirety of the barn had been dug out around its foundation, about 5 feet deep and 3 feet around. He led me across some particle board laid down as sort of a ramp leading inside. The second thing I noticed about the property is that there were no windows. This was clearly a barn meant for livestock. The gentleman leading me on his tour was named Kevin, the owner. He proceeded to tell me his grand plans for the space. It all seemed pretty far-fetched, as it was a big old barn with particle boards separating most of the rooms. He led me up the skeleton stairs made of plywood and 2x4s on the cabin lot, where I would be sleeping that night, along with his family, the mother of his 5-year-old son, his son, and Kevin's own mother. The upstairs was certainly open concept. A frail curtain separated the bed to the sides with a large open area in the middle. I asked if I was his only occupant that night. He said yes. I had a feeling he didn't often get occupants. I told him I was interested in the hikes in the area and wanted to get to them before it got dark. He gave me very detailed instructions of his favorite hikes and how to get to them, and off I went. I figured the place wasn't ideal, and I wish the website would have let me know it was still being built, but hey, I booked last minute and beggars can't be choosers. Plus, he was friendly and helpful on my hiking advice. I hiked the area until it started getting dark. I didn't pack enough food for the day, but I figured I'd head into town for dinner. The nearest town was clearly a booming tourist destination during the summertime, but now in the off-season, it was a ghost town. All the hotels and B&Bs in the area were boarded up. Such a ghost town, even the liquor store was closed for the off-season. Finally, I found a dark, dingy, empty bar to eat dinner. It was, to phrase lightly, a disappointing supper. I had this romantic image in my head of me sitting at the harbor front, sipping on bubbly, slurping back some ocean fresh oysters. I was assured by the server, bartender, cook, the fried oysters I had ordered were definitely not fresh. I figured all my options for things to do and see exhausted. I should just head back to the hostel and read my book. I got back for roughly 8 p.m. and I could smell the family that lived there was in the midst of cooking dinner. A little boy ran down the wood steps to greet me. He yelled, as little boys always do, "My name is JP, what's yours?" I said, "Nice to meet you, JP. My name is Alex." He immediately asked if I wanted to come play. I said definitely. Just let me put my bags down in my room first. He followed me through the translucent curtains to my room, so instead of getting settled in, I just headed straight out into the main area. I started throwing a foam ball around with JP. His mother, father, and grandmother were all just sitting down to eat without even acknowledging we were there playing in front of them. The mother and father just start to what seemed like a basic argument, which then turns them into yelling at each other. Completely weirded out, I told JP, I need to go to my room and call my mom as she's wondering where I am. Of course, the boy who doesn't understand proper boundaries follows me through the curtains and sits on my bed. I try taking his attention away from his family fighting, so I start asking him where he goes to school, his favorite color, etc. His mother starts calling for him. He doesn't answer. Instead, chooses to sit in my lap and hug me. Not wanting to cause any problems, I yell to the mother he's in my room. She runs in and snatches him off my lap and yells to father, "I know what you're like when you get this angry. I'm taking JP, don't follow us." I hear her book it down the stairs and him run after her. I hear a car start up in the lot, and not just driving, but friggin' peeling out of that driveway. I hear him cursing, a door slams, and then the sound of the excavator I had seen outside earlier that day come on. I guess he wanted to do some handiwork to let off some steam. Now, just left upstairs is me and Grandma. I walk out on my not-so-private curtained room with my bag and say, "Listen, you guys have been great hosts, but I should go." She starts rubbing my arm and telling me to stay, explaining her daughter-in-law doesn't understand Kevin like she does, and she's the real problem. Now, I'm ready to tell Grandma to just F off right now and just leave, until I realize she has a knife in her hand from cooking dinner. It's only a 4-inch paring knife, but with intent. I'm sure it would do some damage. I don't think she meant it as a threat. I think she was just a kooky old bird who didn't understand. Maybe don't hold a knife while trying to console a stranger? Now I go along with what she was saying, while she rubs my arm with one hand and flails the knife around in the other. I inch closer and closer downstairs and towards the door. She keeps rubbing my arms and shoulders with her free hand, telling me to stay and that her grandson is special. And before I even booked the night, he had a premonition I would be staying with them. As soon as I get to the door, I run towards my car. I start my engine and back up in the lot to get out of there. Kevin in the excavator blocks the path with about a 5-foot ditch on one side of the drive and a forest behind me. He gets out, says he's sorry, and tells me I should stay. He'll make it up to me. Grandma comes out with a knife still in hand, saying it's Kevin's fault I'm leaving. They bicker for 5 minutes until I yell, "If they don't let me leave, I'm calling the police." All of a sudden, they get super defensive, like I'm the one being unreasonable. So I turn off my engine and start to dial. Kevin gets back in his excavator and starts backing up. As soon as he's far enough, I can see an opening to drive across the grass. I turn my engine back on and rip out of the drive. I'm sure doing a number on the suspension of my little sedan. As soon as the property is out of sight, I go to call my friend Kalaya. No service. I remembered back to earlier in the afternoon when I first got to the hostel. I was going to check my messages and saw the no service sign. Even if I wanted to, I wouldn't have been able to call the police. I drove the 6 hours straight to Moncton, New Brunswick, and stayed with Kalaya.